Hello, I'm Thane Rosenbaum, and welcome to White Rose Magazine's Forum on Art and Ideas. It is a virtual program that we at White Rose Magazine occasionally produce for the purposes of making one of our issues and one important article go acoustic. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on Holocaust education in connection with an article that recently was published by two contributors. Both of them will be with us in a moment. Naya Lekht, who was the special editor for the issue, and Ben Poser, who is a senior editor at White Rose Magazine. If you're here as a subscriber to White Rose Magazine, welcome. We really appreciate your support. If you're here and you're not yet a subscriber, you really ought to be. For those of you who don't already know, White Rose Magazine represents a defense of liberal culture and liberalism in general. It's a magazine that's very much old school in the traditions of liberalism. We're open to ideas, all ideas, without hysteria, without illiberal, anti-intellectual ostracism. It is a magazine that stands for a kind of fidelity to truth and meritocracy and free speech over moral relativism. And if you've been living in the world of magazines and newspapers or ideas, you know that what we represent at White Rose Magazine is nowadays rare. It's a very rare commodity. Everyone seemingly wishes to travel along on the train of woke progressivism. And we're quite sure at White Rose Magazine that train is heading and taking us all off a cliff. So we encourage you to support the magazine, become a member, a donor, a subscriber, tell others about it, and enjoy the programs that we produce, like tonight. Let me introduce Naya Lekht. I think she's going to come up on screen. Hi, Naya. Naya is a contributor at White Rose Magazine, and she was also the special editor of this issue on education. And Ben Poser, where's Ben? Is Ben up? There he goes. Hey, Ben. Ben, welcome. Ben is not only a senior editor at White Rose Magazine, but he and Naya co-wrote this article, When the Holocaust is Not About Hate. And let me just briefly sort of sum up the two very main ideas that come out of the article, and then we'll get into it and talk about things beyond the article. If you have a question for Ben or Naya, please leave it in the Q&A box or maybe the chat box, or both. We'll edit and make sure that it gets to me. Keep your questions short and keep them original and as questions, not little speeches, actual questions. So let's start with the sort of summing up the article. It just seems to me that you're making an argument, a fundamental argument, that Holocaust education has failed in schools and curriculum for two reasons. One of which is because it's been co-opted by a larger progressive agenda to universalize the Holocaust and make it coincide with other acts of inhumanity. So anything from racism to homophobia to climate justice to bullying, you name it, the Holocaust can be used as a portal to address those themes. And your argument seems to me, if you're really there intending to address those themes, then you're not really talking about the Holocaust. You're talking about something else, and you certainly don't know why the Holocaust gets its own category if it's really about something else. Naya, I think your mic is muted, by the way. There we go.
I'm here.
Okay. Ben, and then the second issue that seems to permeate the article is that Holocaust education, aside from this impulse to universalize, has also failed because people don't know enough about the Holocaust. There are a lot of people that purportedly took a course in high school and still can't name Auschwitz, still don't know what the number 6 million means, still somehow learned that Jews are responsible for the Holocaust itself. So that what was the point of having Holocaust education if people are walking around ignorant about the Holocaust. So that's just brief sketch of the main themes. So let me just start off, maybe the two of you or individually. What was the original intent in teaching Holocaust education? What was the founding fathers of this movement? From the article, it seems to be Illinois, I think. But what was the legislative history? What did they say? What did they intend to accomplish, to see how far away they've strayed, given this significance and the importance of what you both wrote about? Naya, why don't you start?
All right. Well, thank you so much. I just want to briefly say thank you to White Rose Magazine for this event this evening, and also to Charles Jacobs and Avi Goldwasser from the Jewish Leadership Project for co-sponsoring this event. And for Ben. Ben is the one who actually came to me and said, we must write an article about the failure of Holocaust education. So it was really Ben's idea, and I ran with it. And the truth of the matter is that this topic has, we wrote it over probably 2 months, but I've been writing it in my mind for years now as an educator. I've been concerned and alarmed about the trends that I've been seeing, and we opened the essay with one such trend, which is this universalization. Now, to answer your question, which is an important one, what were the original forefathers of Holocaust education? What was their intent? So interestingly enough, the intent was actually quite good in the beginning. It was pure in many ways. It was to educate people, to educate students. And yes, Illinois, it was 1990, was that for the reason we used Illinois is that it was the first state to mandate Holocaust education. And initially—
But I'm sorry, but why? What was the impulse? What happened that they decided, what we really need?
Well, I think what really happened was what happened in Skokie, Illinois, which is that march, the neo-Nazi march, that really catapulted that, oh my God, can this really happen in the United States of America? How is it that on our own streets, on the streets of this country, we have this issue? So that's why Illinois became the kind of flagship model in a way. And initially, what they focused on were really four areas in that curriculum. The first was Hitler, the rise of Hitler to power, why or not Nazism in Germany. The second issue that they wanted to teach in that curriculum was why the Jews. The third is non-Jewish victims as well. And the fourth was the rise of totalitarianism in general. So those were the four areas that particular curriculum on the Holocaust wanted to address. So in 1990, I would argue that the learning objectives, the intentions were not terrible. It was really around the 2000s, the early 2000s, that things began to shift, and we can discuss that later. But okay. I just explain that, yeah. So
I'm curious, Ben, if you want to answer this, maybe Naya come back as well, because I'm thinking, well, those are interesting objectives, but those objectives really are purely about teaching sort of history, something that students would not otherwise know when they were learning about World War II. I suspect that somehow teachers in Illinois were not discussing this. And as you're right, the Skokie March might have inspired it, but it does sound like it still had a limited range. Like, for instance, it wasn't intended to prevent future Holocausts. That was not in their mind, right? That at the time, that was a bigger aspiration, that was not that they thought they were trying to do. Or for that matter, did they think that, which I think is an important point that gets missed, is the duty to the dead, to be remembered, right? To be remembered. Clearly, those two ideas were not part of this conversation, Ben, right?
No, it started out, as Naya said, with people like Elie Wiesel, and their principal aim was to teach people about this genocide of the Jews. And the Holocaust was about the Jews, it wasn't about everybody else, even though millions of other people were murdered in the concentration camp system. It was the final solution to the Jewish problem, not to the gay problem, the Catholic priest problem, the communist problem, the social democrat
You're
problem.
saying the other victims. It wasn't, you're saying even Roma, gypsies,
No.
They didn't get the final solution to the Roma gypsies. No one got that title. It was just Jews.
No.
Absolutely. Yeah.
No, and the problem going forward was the fact that how do you sell this to non-Jews, which is a perfectly important question if you're trying to teach about the Holocaust, whether it's near to the event or far. And there, as Thane, you know this very well, there was a very big disagreement between Elie Wiesel and Simon Wiesenthal. Elie Wiesel, who had survived the Holocaust, I forget how many camps he survived. I know he was in Auschwitz and then he was in Buchenwald. The famous photograph shows him in one of the bunks. And he understood that this was about the Jews specifically. And you could never accuse Elie Wiesel of being a man who only cared about Jewish suffering. And it wasn't about that. It wasn't about Jewish suffering being more important than non-Jewish suffering, because it isn't. When Jews die, it's not worse than when non-Jews die. But he understood that the history was very clear.
So what did Simon Wiesenthal? What was
Wiesenthal wanted? And this is very understandable. How do you make this accessible to non-Jews? He said that this was basic, that you had to sell this as a crime against humanity. And we all know that phrase. Many of the Nazis who were executed at Nuremberg, they were executed for crimes against humanity.
But just to be clear,
yeah?
Sorry to jump in here to make it clear for the audience. This is, where being a law professor helps. Crimes against humanity was a crime that was invented at Nuremberg.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't exist. It was itself a crime. This is one of the things that the German defense attorneys said. You can't invent a crime.
Exactly.
Your own constitution has prohibitions against retroactive punishment. So you can't punish my clients for crimes that weren't crimes when they committed them. Exactly. So you're violating your own constitutional principles. So when you hear the words crimes against humanity, it's important to remember that the German defense attorneys were not wrong when they said, where did you come up with that? That doesn't exist on your American criminal law books. It's not here. You brought it to Nuremberg and invented it here. So you're right. But so that idea, you're saying it was started at Nuremberg, right? It didn't say for the mass murder of Jews. It said for crimes against humanity.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
But I
go
just
ahead, Naya. Go ahead.
I just want to, you asked you said, in the beginning, it seemed to have wanted to teach about the history of the Holocaust. And then later on, it shifted towards teaching people about the dangers of crimes against humanity, about the dangers of the Holocaust, and try to instill through the education people to stop wanting, let's say, or supporting states that can, create such terrible policies that lead towards genocide. In writing this piece and thinking of it, I've been thinking, is that really why we study history? Is that really why we're studying about the Holocaust, in order to stop another Holocaust? I mean, that's the bigger question for me.
Good point.
What role does history play? The field of history in general? And also, it's important who are our students? Who's the student? Because the Jewish student versus the non-Jewish student, it's a very different lesson.
Yeah, but I don't like the thing that what Ben was saying before. I want to jump back to that because you just triggered a thought here, Naya.
Okay.
Because Ben raised this important distinction between Wiesel and Wiesenthal, right? One could be the godfather of universalism, right? You could say that Wiesenthal was trying to, how do we sell this? As if we have to sell this somehow to the world more expansively.
It's a perfectly understandable intention. It's not that we're trying to, hurt his memory. It's this. Listen, but how are other people who aren't Jewish can understand? So that's just as a baseline.
But when we teach the Civil War, we don't say we need to teach all the Civil Wars. You can't teach. You can't teach the American Civil War unless you understand the Syrian Civil War. What are you, crazy? Like, why is it about the Holocaust that if you study the Holocaust, immediately, because I think in your article, both of you point out something I didn't know, that it wasn't long into the Illinois experience when other states picked up and all of a sudden they mandated it can't just be about the Holocaust.
Correct.
That the state legislatures actually debated that you had to expand it. And is it because of what Wiesenthal was saying, that we need to be able to broaden the sense of empathy by bringing in others, not just happening to the Jews? Where did this come from? Because it seems very interesting, and it's an interesting question, and it undermines the uniqueness of the Holocaust, right, which is the point that Ben said. Elie Wiesel thought that the word Holocaust should apply to Jews and to Jews only, and not to victims of AIDS. You know, it's like somehow, yeah, that's terrible disease, but the Holocaust for the gay community is not the right word for the use of AIDS. So anyway, what happened that somehow legislators decided to mandate inclusion of other genocides in a way we would never do with other civil wars?
What happened was that the American Jewish establishment, certain legacy organizations, had a big say and in shaping the curriculum and the trajectory of that curriculum. And under the aegis of inclusivity, right, under that type of umbrella or framing, the phrase never again began to appear. The ADL was one of the first to use that phrase. Now, interestingly, and we talk about this briefly in this.
It's in your article, right?
Right. That phrase actually comes from Menachem Begin's memoirs. It's the first page. Never again, and I just want to, I have the quote here. I just want to make sure everybody can see. It says, "For he, that is, the Gentile, has learned the simple truth of life and death, and he will never again," I'm sorry, not the Gentile, the Jew. "For he has learned that simple truth of life and death, and he will never again go down to the sides of the pits and vanish from the earth," he being the Jew. This is, never again is not about climate justice. Never again is not about reproductive justice. Never again was used very, very intentionally by a person whose family had perished is putting it mildly, killed, right, by the Nazis and their collaborators. But to answer your bigger question, this came from the Jewish establishment. The Jewish establishment under, kind of this tikkun olam, right, repairing the world. This is something that I also study and write about, which is Jewish education in the United States of America. What has happened to Jewish education in the United States of America is under these slogans, under these piecemeal quotes that they bring from the Tanakh, they inject a woke, if you want to say, reading on ancient texts. So now they bring into, through Tikkun Olam, they basically universalize the Holocaust, universalize never again. In my opinion, it was done by the Jewish organizations.
So you're saying, and Ben, please jump in here as well.
Happy to.
You're saying that there was for whatever reason, and maybe both of you can tell us why, that Jewish legacy organizations did not like the look of special pleading.
No,
right?
they did not.
They did not like the look of special suffering. They did not like the idea that Jews had a monopoly on suffering, and that they felt, for whatever reason, maybe you can help us understand, that it was important for Jews to send that message to the world, that we think that this is a universal message. It doesn't only apply to us.
Yes, absolutely. And it makes sense if you understand the diasporic Jewish experience, especially in the United States of America, and not even the United States. There's this constant tension between particularism and universalism, right? There's this constant tension of Jewish identity. Do we belong to a particular group? People from those legacy organizations would scoff at that, because if you are particular, you're parochial, you're shtetl-like. No, our goal is to be the light unto the nations, right? Our goal is that we're supposed to, our message is universal. And what in that tension between particularism and universalism, those Jews who wanted to appeal to integrate into society gravitate towards universalism. And that's why they don't want to teach that the Holocaust is only about Jews, because that reinforces this idea of the Jews are really a particular people, a parochial people, a backward people.
It isn't even worse than now, Ben. And I know this is something you've given a lot of thought to. It's worse today because the particularism that Naya is discussing, that she says actually was at its origins, particularism was what the founding fathers of Holocaust education were thinking about. But if you believe in the uniqueness,
Founding fathers of Judaism we're talking about.
Right, if you believe in the uniqueness of the Holocaust, then you're challenging the premises of white privilege, right? That
Exactly.
It undermines the presumptions of white privilege if you're focusing on the specialness of this crime, right? Because I think that the people who believe in white privilege are saying the only crimes that really matter are crimes against people who are darker skinned. So the Holocaust, if you're trying to say it's unlike any other genocide, that's very problematic, because the other genocides seem to also affect people of dark skin, and it doesn't play nicely into the racism paradigm. So I'm wondering whether you can address that, because I think particularism is threatening to anyone that believes in woke progressivism.
Yeah, yes,
I mean,
because
you can sum this up, with two words: Whoopi Goldberg.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And what was interesting, what almost impressed me, is that she used.
Can you just explain to the audience what you mean?
Of course I can. So about a year and a bit ago, Whoopi Goldberg decided to tell everybody how smart she is when she said that the Holocaust was not about race, and it basically was white on white crime. I don't know if she said those exact words, but that was basically what.
No, she actually said man's inhumanity to man.
Well, and she said man's inhumanity to man, which is a very old phrase, which goes back really to, I think, just after the war. And I was impressed that she even knew something like that. But what she was talking about, and she wasn't talking about universalization, but she was using a phrase of universalization to say, well, what happened to you Jews isn't so important, because we're now in the game of one-upsmanship of who suffered more as a competition, not as historical conjecture or even historical argument. It's about who deserves more love and sugar in a political sense, and I wish I didn't have to say it that way, but that's what is going on. And
go ahead. Go ahead.
And Whoopi touched on this in a particularly nasty way. And Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the 80 Hell, it was his responsibility to say, okay, Whoopi, because The View is a politics show, I don't know why anybody watched The View, but it's a politics show. So it has a very large cultural and political influence. So you, Whoopi, have a responsibility to be honest about history if you know any. And evidently you know a little bit about history enough to say this. So you have to understand that the Holocaust was about Jews. It's not about white people. It's not about black people.
But isn't it also about race?
Wasn't she wrong?
Wasn't she wrong when she?
Yeah, she was.
Wasn't she wrong when she said it's not about race? Wasn't she wrong? I mean, the Nazis considered themselves the master race, and the Jews were the inferior race. So how can you argue that the Holocaust
Jews are white? Because for her, Jews are white, and so therefore, it can't compute in her mind. I mean, that it was about race, because we're talking about two similar races. How can it be about race if they're white, if Germans are white and Jews are white? But she's just we could spend a lot of time. I mean, of course, yes, her voice is amplified, but unfortunately, she's just not very educated. So
let's go to another topic that I'm not sure you guys are going to love, but because it's a complicated question and something I've written about many years ago, which is that why should we be surprised by universality? Why should it surprise us? Because this issue preceded Holocaust education by many years, and it literally started in places that we consider to be iconic canons. like, for instance, the Diary of Anne Frank. You know, Otto Frank was among certain people widely criticized for editing his daughter's diary and ripping out her focus on Jews for the same reason. He wanted the book to be published. He wanted the world to know about his precocious daughter. He didn't like that his daughter had angry things to say about her mom. He got rid of that. He got rid of, you know, he left stuff in the book that said that she loved Christmas trees and the Queen of England and American movies. Because guess what? That's not Jewish, right? Let Anne talk to the world, not to Jews, not to be particular. And even Elie Wiesel, sainted as he is, I just read a wonderful biography that's coming out soon, or think if it's not, Joseph Berger's book on Elie Wiesel. It's a phenomenal book to read. But he makes an argument that the night when it was published in France was like 5 times larger in size and was angry as hell.
In Yiddish, the original.
In Yiddish, the
Yes.
original. It was angry. So you know more about this. So there you go, that somehow when Elie Wiesel got
He toned it
translated
down
into
and
English.
universalized. Yes.
Exactly. So even Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel, right? Now, maybe you could say those were good ideas to do, that no one would know who Anne Frank was if her father had not betrayed her by universalizing the diary, and that Elie Wiesel would not have become a Nobel Peace Prize winner had his original Yiddish book been translated into English. And it's a complicated, to me, it's a moral question, and it's a question about aesthetics, but it also has something to do with Holocaust education. What do you think, guys?
Elie Wiesel's Night, which was originally in Yiddish, was much more angry, as you say, but it also had much more vengeance and revenge. And when he wrote it in another language, he completely excised that anger and even more that revenge, that Jewish vengeance. He wasn't a Menachem Begin figure, though, Elie Wiesel. He wasn't. Which brings us to, the question, these are different figures. Elie Wiesel wanted to speak to mankind. He wanted his Holocaust experience to be relevant and to relate to the world. Menachem Begin was speaking to the Jewish people. This is a question of audience and to whom are you speaking? And Elie Wiesel lived in the diaspora. He did not live in an ancestral homeland. So that is also a little bit different. But once again, it's interesting. You asked us both, how do we explain, how did it become universal? How did the mandates turn to becoming more universal? And I explained, they came from the Jews. And we see it's Jews who are self-imposing, who are censoring themselves, in many ways, their particularism, in order to have a universal message. Is that good? It's an important question. Ben,
do you have something? Want to add to that question about we shouldn't be surprised about universality because
no, we shouldn't.
It's something?
No, because again, Judaism is a mix of universality and particularism. God is the God of the whole world. God created everybody. God loves everybody. God made the whole world. God made China too, as well as Israel. So, and that's not wrong. That's real. But the Jews are a specific people with a specific heritage, a specific religion. Alan Dershowitz says somewhere, I think the book, The Case for Peace, Judaism is a civilization. It began as a religion. It's not just a religion. That's a very important aspect of it, but it's this whole, I like to think of it as like a pull-down menu on a website, where you hold your cursor over and there's an arrow which comes down and it shows all these other things. You've got language, you've got culture, you have history, you have, some biological heritage. You have all these other things which come down. And the Jews have a particular history. And the Holocaust is not, firstly, it's not the only important part of that history. I know it's relatively recent, but it is one chapter in it. And you can't talk about the Holocaust without putting it in context.
Well, that goes to the question that I want to get to next, which is the problem just the universality, or is the curriculum itself bad? In other words, would you look at the curriculum, and I, as an educator, and say, you know, Thane, as a matter of fact, the right books are on there. The right topics are right there. It's not like the topics aren't there. They're just being de-emphasized, or they're being taught in a different way. Or are you saying, Thane, there is really a syllabus I have in mind that is not being used, but it's a really good one, and that's what we should be arguing for?
Okay, great question. I love it because it speaks to my educator heart. Let me just go back to Yiddish for just a second. The Yiddish language does not have the word Holocaust. In Yiddish, it's Horban. Hurban from the Hebrew, which means sacrifice, but in Yiddish, it meant catastrophe. Yiddish writers did not talk about the Holocaust as a separate particular event. Interestingly enough, they used the word Horban to discuss the Holocaust, the first Horban for the Jewish people being the destruction of the Second Temple. So through that lens, meaning, i.e., through the lens of looking at Jewish history as a chain of Horbans in a way, okay? Well, I mean, I didn't
one catastrophe after another
catastrophe, right? So if I was the curriculum writer at a Jewish school, I would not have a separate class on the Holocaust. It would be under the history of anti-Semitism. That's where the Holocaust fits in. Part of that, what Salo Baron called this lachrymose narrative of the Jewish people. I would not have a standalone class on the Holocaust. Why? Because, and I've had this many times when I go to Jewish day schools and ask them, are you guys teaching about anti-Semitism? Yeah, we've got a whole robust Holocaust program. Okay, the Holocaust is not going to teach you about contemporary anti-Semitism, because you're also not treating it as part of the story of anti-Semitism, part of that succession of Horbans. So is it that the curriculum is bad? Well, it depends what curriculum. Unfortunately, Facing History, we know this organization, they have for teachers.
Is it about Facing History Ourselves or something like that? Is that what it's called?
No, it's called Facing History and Ourselves.
And ourselves.
You know, it's interesting. Ben actually sent me the teacher's resource from 1994, which isn't very terrible. It's actually quite good. Again, I do believe that in the beginning, the writers of the curriculum had the correct learning objectives, which is to teach about the history of the destruction of the Jewish people. That's what it was about. It moved to it now has a very different teaching objective. If you look at now teaching, Facing History and Ourselves, now at ADL curriculum, what is the lessons of the Holocaust? That othering people is dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, that's not true. The German Jews were very successful. The German Jews were highly integrated. They weren't the quintessential other in the German society. So that can't be it. I'm sorry, are they not teaching about anti-Semitism? They're instead calling something the Holocaust and universalizing that, and they're staying away from what we would say is traditional Jew hatred? They're not placing it in the context of the history of anti-Semitism. It's about bigotry. It's about intolerance. It's about the dangers of bullying and othering other people. It's about how terrible persecution is. That's why we cannot even be upset with these students who walk out and think, oh, the lessons of the Holocaust is that I must stand up for injustice.
But are we? I'm sorry, I got to push back a little here. Again, I have looked at the last 5 years in the Trump era, in particular, and I look at this and say, well, you know, is it caused by Holocaust education that the Holocaust itself is so easily trivialized, right? The people that killed George Floyd are not Gestapo agents. They're not Nazis. Donald Trump was not Hitler.
No.
right? The way that we have incorporated the language of the Nazis
Exactly.
to trivialize the Holocaust by using it in a misapplied way that makes people inured, desensitized to what the Holocaust was. You remember that in Seinfeld, there was the soup Nazi, right? Like we're starting to, this is a long-standing practice of taking something that was from another world of inhumanity and normalizing it. I think that's the right word.
Well, I'm in agreement with you. I don't think that in that way you're pushing back, but I want to return to the question that you're asking, which is what kind of curriculum should we pursue? How should we teach about the Holocaust? Should we teach about it on its own? I don't think so. I think it belongs in history of the Jewish people, history of anti-Semitism, which we didn't even talk about museums as well. Because
I'm going to get to that in a second.
Education is not only happening in the classroom, it's also the museums.
Yeah.
But
well, let me just get to that first, and then I'll get back to something I want to ask Ben, which was that a few years ago during the pandemic, I was interviewed by a newspaper in Florida because the Orlando Holocaust Museum had a George Floyd exhibit. And when they called me and asked me about it, I told them it was scandalous. And the executive director said, and even one of the board of directors, how could you say such a thing? Don't you realize how important it is for the museum to show that Jews see the crimes committed against Jews as something that is shared by all people? And then I thought, are we really saying that what happened to George Floyd belongs in a Holocaust museum? And it was in Orlando.
Well, yes, it does. If your learning objective is to teach that the Holocaust should be a lesson that we shouldn't the dangers on othering, the dangers of racism, the dangers of marginalized minorities. It makes sense. I'm not surprised that it made its way to the Holocaust Museum. But Ben, what are your thoughts?
I'm not surprised at all. And one thing, I do something very Jewish here. And before I give my answer, I'll ask questions. So there's a George Floyd exhibit at a Holocaust museum. Where the hell are Jewish leaders saying what on earth is going on? You're
saying why was I being interviewed? It should have been somebody who's really runs a legacy organization.
Well, if you want to be that humble, then be that humble.
It should have been pounding on the table. This is not something appropriate for a museum.
Exactly. Jonathan Greenblatt should have bruised his hand, smashing on the table, saying, "Excuse me, how dare you say that, regardless of your opinion of the incident, that this incident, this law enforcement incident, which is very complicated, has a lot of factors, is the same thing as Jews being stuck in gas chambers because they were Jews, whether they believed in Christianity or not, whether they were atheist, whatever, it's because they were Jews. Why is this the same thing? Holocaust Museum. Nobody said that. Now, that's just my preface there, because a lot of this stuff, and we talk about this in a few minutes if we have time, but a lot of this stuff, and Naya's mentioned this, a lot of this stuff has to do with Jewish leaders who have completely different priorities than safeguarding the Jewish people's memory. They have.
But can I? Yeah, go ahead. I want to ask you something about that. So finish up, and I'll ask you something.
They have an agenda which has to do with the fact that they have a certain political view of the world, which is universalist, and they're assimilated into the leftist progressive way of thinking, and they're not interested in the Jews. Now, to answer the question, now why would a Holocaust museum do that? It actually ties back to what I just said. That's why I said it. They believe in that worldview. They're not really interested in presenting the history in a way which honors the dead, and they're not interested in the most important thing, certainly, which is presenting the fact that the Holocaust is about Jews and not everybody else in context. The Holocaust, as I may have mentioned this before, but somebody once said that text without context is pretext. It's nothing. You can take two words from a Shakespeare sonnet and ask some kid in your literature class, what does this mean to you? Well, it can mean anything you want because it's out of context. The same thing with a Bible verse. The same thing with a part of a book. People misquote each other all the time by taking things out of context. The quotation can be what's on the page, but that's not what the person said. So the issue here is that the Holocaust is about everybody, not about to whom it happened. And this is the fact that this doesn't offend Jews is a shanda, and this is the definition of shanda for the goyim, because it's Jews doing things which make Jews look like they don't care about being Jews.
Yeah, but there's a bad history here. And as much as I am as critical as anybody about the Jewish legacy institutions, I would wonder whether both of you might respond to something that we also know about American Jewry, which is that they didn't protest in the lynching of Leo Frank.
No.
They didn't protest. They didn't chain themselves to the White House during the Holocaust. You know, on the other hand, they showed up in droves during the Civil Rights Movement.
Exactly.
And many of them were killed and their heads were clubbed in. And so when it goes back to this idea that I wonder whether it ties into what Naya said earlier about tikkun olam, that we just like the idea better of arguing on behalf of other people. And we just are not, we're not comfortable, aside from the movement to free Soviet Jewry, I have never seen Jews stand up for Jews. I've never seen it. Look at the Jews, the Hasidic Jews that have been beaten in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And I've written about this. I'm shocked. No one wants to talk about beating up Hasidic Jews it's just not very interesting, or it's not woke. So I'm saying, yes, as much as I would blame Jewish leaders, and maybe Jewish leaders are primarily responsible, but maybe there's something in our people that they're not enough Menachem Begins, and they're just too many of the ones that are just willing to say, I'm just not going to defend Jews. Why would I do that?
I just want to say one thing before that, and I know Naya's lips are puckering in the sense that she's desperate to speak. So I just want to say one thing very quickly. So, and I said this to you, Thane, before, earlier this week or last week. It was that by the logic of universalization, because Jews, half the freedom riders who were white were Jews. This is well known. Because some of them were murdered by the same Klansmen, white supremacist maggots who murdered blacks and oppressed them in the southern states. Because some of them were murdered during the Civil Rights Movement, then slavery, of which segregation is a legacy, was actually about the Jews. Now, if I were black, I would not appreciate that one bit. Why is that okay? If excuse me, I'm black. My slavery wasn't about me and my ancestors. It's just about some people who came along later, even though I like them and I appreciate what they did. Why is it about them? And maybe we should be talking about this issue in such a way that really, I understand the use for universalization. It doesn't come from an evil part of us, but it is a problem. And I want to let Naya talk, because Naya, definitely looks like she's itching to go.
You go, girl.
Okay, I just want to offer two case studies, one from the United States and one from Soviet Union, of the universalization tendency. So when the American Jews arrived in 1885 here, they penned the very famous Pittsburgh Manifesto, which I keep on bringing it up all the time, but it really has had it has cast a long shadow on American Jewry. In 1885, Jews in Pittsburgh came together for a plenary session. In it, they discussed what would be their, Hinenu, we're here, we're in the United States of America. What does it mean to be a Jew in the United States of America? And they listed 10 principles, 11. Don't quote me on the exact number. What's really important is that they proclaimed that they are only a religion, not an ethnicity, and thus they will jettison their they jettisoned that Palestine, or Eretz Israel, is their ethnic homeland, or any homeland, really. It's a spiritual center at best. And I cannot blame them, because in the context of America, America being the land of people seeking fleeing from religious persecution, America being a country that will protect religious minorities, I understand that impulse. Now, what's happened is that now we have Jews in the United States of America who don't see themselves as part of an ethnicity, as a tribe, because again,
Not a
that's
race. Not a race.
We don't.
Different thing.
We're not. Whatever. We don't. It's too parochial. We're not a tribe. It's too parochial to see ourselves this way. Okay. We did this to ourselves. Soviet Union, a little bit of a different example. When the revolution came, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, right around that time, there formed a group called the Yevsektsaya, or the Jewish section of the Communist Party. And their goal, that their entire raison d'etre, was to go after parochial Jews, particular Jews on the streets, shame them, cut their beards off, told to shave your beards. It's time to be a Novy Soviet, excuse me, I'm speaking in Russian, a new Soviet person. And in doing that, what did they do? They shed their particular identity. It's nothing new. What I'm trying to say is that this is sort of what has happened to Jews ever since they have been, experienced the diaspora, ever since they lost their political sovereignty in Judea. This has been our experience. Would be interesting, and we can't cover it in this hour, is how is Holocaust education treated in Israel? That's interesting. I'd like to understand. That's something I'd like to explore personally.
So
where
let
you don't
me
have that diasporic shadow cast upon you.
I think the audience should know it's in the article, and I'm encouraging you all to become subscribers to White Rose Magazine.
I'm going to see if I can post the link to that in the chat and pin it.
Okay. I just think I want to remind that there's just the article that the two of you wrote is just filled with lots of interesting things, including I didn't know that even though we're lamenting the state of Holocaust education, I did not know until I read Naya and Ben's article that it appears as if 25 states now mandate Holocaust education. That's half the country. That's pretty incredible.
I know, but
half the country, and yet we're lamenting how badly done it is.
Yeah, I'm not really happy about it, but
yeah, exactly. I love that. Right. Let me ask you something else you're not happy about, and then after that, I'll start take a few questions from the audience, and we'll say goodnight to you guys.
We happen to anything here?
What's that?
We happen to anything here?
I couldn't really hear you.
Happy about anything here?
Yeah, I don't know. Probably not. Nor should we. What about the weaponization of the Holocaust? A different use of Holocaust education to say, well, it's good to teach the Holocaust if you want to say that Jews learned the lessons of the Nazis and now they're doing it to the Palestinians. Let everyone know where the Jews learned how to do this. No. We're not denying the Holocaust. We think that the Jews have co-opted the Nazis and they're instilling the final solution to the Palestinian question. So this to me is the most disgraceful, misapplication of all, saying we're okay with this education as long as we get to use it to pummel Jews and make it a human rights issue on behalf of Palestinians.
Ben, do you want to take that?
Well, I just want to, I've very heard I'd say, and alhamdulillah, thank you for asking that question. So also somebody in the chat said that it's very, very important that not only should we teach Holocaust education in the context of anti-Semitism across history, we also need to extend that history both vertically and horizontally to include, laterally, to include Islamic Jew hatred. And this is what's going on, right? This is what this question is about. So this is a very smart thing people do. And universalization is part of the door, which is the watertight door, which is raised when the ship is sinking and allows the water in. So this is major, major, major problem, because people say this all the time. Edward Said said it. Umar Barghouti said it. Really every Islamic Jew hater, every Palestinian leader, every terrorist you care to name has used something like this. And do I have what do I have to say to that? Well, it's not reason to not teach people about the Holocaust. I think the way you deal with this is to show that the history of the history you should be covering in the curriculum, and Naya and I have talked about this, is it has to include a serious and truthful telling of the birth of Israel. Because first of all, if you teach the Holocaust without the birth of Israel, then okay, the Jews just died and they lost, and you get, Dara Horn's book, Everyone Loves Dead Jews. Well, the Jews aren't dead, we're here. I mean, it's difficult to have a webinar if we're all dead. So the Jews came back to their ancient land, and very few people live there, and on and on. I'm not going to tell this whole story, we don't have time. But you have to make sure that the Holocaust is taught in a way, and I hope I'm making sense here, that is based upon the particularity of it, because if it's not, then you can use it for this. And if the Holocaust is about everybody, then you bet the top of everybody is the Palestinians, because the Jews stole their land and they murdered them and they killed their babies and they have their keys. The Nazis stole Jewish property and stole Jewish houses. We've all heard the survivors tell, coming home was my worst nightmare. I came home and I never looked back. I went to my house and there was somebody else there. And he said, what the hell are you doing? This is my house. And so if you don't teach the Holocaust properly and say it was about the Jews, then this is what's going to happen. And maybe you could say, I'm not saying this is literally true, but it definitely adds to this, that you are, just let me finish, that you are helping along the propaganda narrative, the people who want to repeat the Holocaust.
So let me take a few questions from the audience. One is just very related to what you just are talking about.
The length of my rant there, excuse me.
This comes from one of our heroes, Charles Jacobs. Why do so many think Holocaust education will diminish today's Jew hatred when the sources of much of that hate is from the left, from minorities, including elements within the Black community and radical Muslims?
Can I take that question, please? I think it's really important.
Please.
There's this false belief, once again, and Dara Horn deals with it also in her recent piece in The Atlantic, that if we teach the Holocaust, we will inoculate children, learners, and they will not be anti-Semites, okay? They will not be bigots. The truth of the matter is that, as Charles Jacobs rightly points out, today's anti-Semitism, and we know why anti-Semitism is one of the most complex forms of hatred. Like a virus, it mutates. We are not living in the era of anti-Semitism. We are living in the era of anti-Zionism. Anti-Semitism is the era of racist ideology, is the idea that the Jewish race was subhuman. Nobody's running around. I mean, albeit, yes, we have, nobody's denying that there are far-right neo-Nazis. But to Charles Jacobs' point, most of the anti-Semitism is about, it's not about dehumanizing. Nobody's dehumanizing the state of Israel. It's what's coming back. It's blood libel, it's delegitimization, it's demonization of the state of Israel, the Jewish people. That is not what the Jewish people lived under during the era of the Nazis. So that's why the Holocaust education is not going to prepare you to understand modern day anti-Semitism. We're not living in the time where Jews are dehumanized. We're actually quite the opposite. We're seen as powerful. What we have is the resurfacing of another older accusation trope, power, right? Jewish power, control. So that's why people who think that if they will teach about the Holocaust, they will inoculate people and therefore no longer be anti-Semites are absolutely wrong. Anti-Semitism is as a hatred sees the Jews as both being subhuman, but also supernatural powers.
Right. Both things are happening at the same time, oddly, with Jews. Ben, why don't you take briefly, since Charles just asked that question, to pitch that book, and then I'll come to one last question from the audience and we'll say goodnight.
Okay, so this is as shameless can possibly get. So Charles Jacobs, the president of the Jewish Leadership Project, also Avi Goldwasser, who is on the Zoom right now, and myself, and Naya, and Thane, this is very mature, are in this book, which is just published this just a couple of weeks ago, Betrayal, the Failure of American
And
Jewish.
it is not just published, but it's also a White Rose magazine production.
Exactly.
This was something, most of the articles that once originally appeared in an issue that Charles and Avi specially edited. Okay, go ahead. I just want to make sure the audience knows this is part of the entire Karen Lehrman block enterprise.
Yes, I will try to put a link to the Amazon in the chat here. But this book started out as an issue of White Rose of spring 2022. And it owes itself entirely to Karen's vision, genius, and chutzpah to actually talk about this when nobody else really wants to. And it's a collection of 22 essays by people who's no one cares about, like me, people do care about, like Alan Dershowitz and Caroline Glick and Mort Klein and Jonathan Tobin and Richard Landis and maybe even Thane Rosenbaum. And it is a masterfully well-produced collection of essays about the failure of Jewish leadership in the face of exactly what we've been talking about here.
Sign up for White Rose magazine, become a subscriber, and get this new book that is part of White Rose magazine. It's the first book that was published under our label, and again, with Charles's vision and Avi's vision. One last question. Let me give it to a woman named Roz Shorenstein. Naya, get ready, because this should really go to you, I think, because she's talking about the flip side of the thing that you have now told us is dangerous about Holocaust education and why you're opposed to it. She says, please give some advice on ethnic studies curriculum, right? Because currently in California, school districts are being marketed successfully by, quote, consultants pushing a very anti-Semitic curriculum. So I read Roz's question as saying it actually is coming from two sides. Holocaust education actually is producing some of the very pernicious ideas about Jews that you're getting out of ethnic studies curriculum. They're both, doubling down on each other.
Well, listen, I think I'm the only one on this Zoom call right now sitting in the state of California.
Condolences.
Yes, it is a terrible, what I would call educational malpractice of ethnic studies, many Jewish organizations, grassroots organizations, have been fighting. Have we lost? In many ways, yes. In many ways, I think that parents are waking up and, asking their students, what's going on in your classes? What are you learning? But here's the thing that I'd like to tell the audience or the viewers today is one of the things that, as I was seeing the way that many Jewish organizations were trying to combat ethnic studies, what I thought was actually detrimental was they said, oh, well, if we just could bring a unit on the Holocaust, right? If we could just show, we have a unit on Jews of color, if we could just have those units as part of ethnic studies, we'll be okay. No, you won't be okay. And I'll tell you why you won't be okay, because the entire ethnic studies curriculum is built on a framework of power and powerlessness. And if all you're trying to do is prove we're victims too. Take us at the intersectional table. We have Jews of color. We have them here they are. Thank God. That's not the issue. The issue with ethnic studies is not just the anti-Semitism, it's the anti-Americanism, it's the anti-Western attitudes. That's the bigger problem. And you're not fixing it by bringing in a Holocaust unit or a unit on Jews of color. And I know that that's hard to hear for some people, but I implore parents on this call, I implore, if anybody's in administration, ethnic studies is very, very dangerous, not just to Jews, but to us as Americans.
Tonight's White Rose Magazine Forum on Art and Ideas has come to an end. It was a stimulating hour. We can tell from the comments that it's people still want to continue talking about it. Again, I encourage you to subscribe to the White Rose magazine. Also participate in the Jewish Leadership Project. Buy this new book that came out of both of those programs. And of course, make sure you read Naya and Ben's article, because it's filled with lots of stuff that we didn't even get a chance to talk about. But remember, if you love Naya and Ben, you're just going to love White Rose magazine, because they're contributors. You'll see them all the time. They're editing it. I'm Thane Rosenbaum for White Rose Magazine's Forum on Art and Ideas. Good night to all of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Good night, Ben and Naya. Thank you.